Welcome to part 2 of the Chapter 23 presentation, and you will hear the bell during this presentation, possibly, so just be aware. Okay, so let's look at the main players. The first out of the gates are the Portuguese. The Portuguese have a huge motivation in that they are a people desperate for land and resources. And this leads to their initial exploration under the capable leadership of Dom Enrique, or Prince Henry. Portugal extended its maritime leadership after Prince Henry builds his School of Navigation, which brings together all kinds of specialists in navigation to build better ships, to learn better techniques, to kind of combine all of the knowledge out there to create a better navigation, kind of like Silicon Valley does today for technology. So Bartholomew Diaz is one of the key players. He actually rounds the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, so the tip of Africa, showing people that really this continent could be gotten around. And from there, people kept moving further around Africa until we get to Da Gama. Vasco da Gama made it all the way to India in 1498, so 10 years later. And when he arrived in India, he found that or in the Indian Ocean, he found that there were already so many traders around. And he was really a very harsh guy. There's an account of him coming in or arriving in port, finding a ship of Muslims who are going on their Hajj and destroying or murdering all of them and taking their gold that they had with them. He was pretty cutthroat and ruthless. But he also showed Europeans that they could make it all the way to India and that they could gain a tremendous profit. Next, getting into the exploration game is Spain. That makes sense because they're right next to each other. They enter the competition when Fernando and Isabel bankroll the plan by Cristoforo Colombo, or Christopher Columbus, to reach India by a western route. Although Columbus's estimations of size of the Earth were way off, he managed to reach landfall in San Salvador in 1492, and the English, French, and Dutch competitors followed quickly. Ironically, most of the early exploration of the Americas was designed to find a way around it. To get to the rich markets of Asia. Then we have Ferdinand Magellan circumnavigating the world from 1519 to 1524. Hence, the Straits of Magellan in the far south of South America. This was the beginning of the first serious exploration of the Pacific. Next, we'll move into the English. The English get into exploration with the Americas, but in the 1700s, they have an explorer who, by the name of Cook, James Cook, who explored Australia, New Zealand, and Hawaii in the 18th century, so in the 1700s. And he's included in this chapter not because he's within our time period, but because he's also an explorer. So those places remained isolated until the 1700s. And then also Vitus Bering and other explorers explored the Arctic in the service of Russia. Of course, you had the French getting in here too, and also the Netherlands, but these are four of the main players early on. So this is Vasco da Gama's route, and this is Magellan's route. Unfortunately, as you can see here, Magellan didn't actually make it all the way around the ocean, the world. He started in Lisbon, he makes it through the Straits of Magellan, goes through the Pacific. By the time his troops get through the Pacific, they have lost most of their ships and most of their crew. In fact, only 20 something of the original hundreds of sailors made it back to Lisbon eventually. So Magellan died in the Philippines in a scuffle with some locals, and his troops by this time had almost mutinied, and they were forced to eat the leather on their shoes for sustenance. They moved through the Indian Ocean and up the coast of Africa, and like I said, only about 20 something of them make it back to Portugal. This is a picture of Cook's explorations, and we'll come back to this later on. And also, you can see that he also does explore the Arctic, but really moves around New Zealand, Australia. He's the first to see Easter Island, first European, that is, and also goes all the way down to Antarctica. Okay, so once the Europeans arrive in an area, they would usually attempt to dominate trade. But in most of the Eastern Hemisphere, they lacked really the personnel or the military to make this dream a reality. The Portuguese took advantage of their head start and established the first trading post empire. Instead of dominating trade, what these people would do is create trading posts. They basically set up an island, right? Put their little flag on it, and then when a ship came close to it, they would make them pay money, like a toll road, to pass through. And if they didn't, they'd come after them with their military. They controlled more than 50 trading posts between West Africa and East Africa by the middle of the 16th century. The goal was to force merchant ships, like I said, to pay duties at fortified trading posts or forts. And as time passed, the Portuguese approach turned more militaristic. You can see this with Alfonso de Albuquerque, who had a conquest of Hormuz, Goa, and Malacca. So they got a little less benign, is what this is saying. They were more aggressive. In the end, though, the Portuguese simply didn't have enough power to maintain their early control, and they were superseded by the English and the Dutch. They didn't have the men, they didn't have English, Dutch, and the French, excuse me. The Dutch are also the Netherlands. They didn't have the men, they didn't have the tax resources, they didn't have the stability, they didn't have the innovation like these other countries did. For example, Malacca fell under Dutch control, a key city in the Indian Ocean, in 1641. The success of the English and the Dutch was based on two factors, and that's what we'll talk about in the next slide. Oh, excuse me. That's what we'll talk about in a moment. First, we want to talk a little bit about the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War lasted from 1756 to 1763. This is really a turning point in history, and it was built on the commercial rivalries between the empires at the sea. And the main players were the French and the English, again, of course. But this conflict erupted in multiple theaters in Europe, India, Caribbean, and North America. This, in America, merged with the French and Indian War and led to the high taxation of the British colonies. The British won this war. This was one of those turning points in history where if the French had won this war, they would be the dominant power. But the British won this war. They emerged victorious and established diplomacy in India and Canada, which is still, Canada is still associated with the king, and India was until right after World War II. So this was a pretty important thing. These are the different areas where the war was fought and different countries involved. Okay, so in the next portion of this PowerPoint, we'll talk about what made the English and the Dutch so successful, and also go into the colonies that were set up.